The archive doors open with a hiss, and what spills forth is not rumor, but the remnants of dossiers once marked with heavy black stamps. Top secret, eyes only, burn after reading. For decades, they were hidden in basements of ministries, buried under Cold War dust, sealed by men who believed silence was more powerful than truth. Each file is a scar on the record of World War II, stories deliberately buried by victors and vanquished alike. The fragments whisper of broken alliances, secret codes, missing convoys, and treaties signed under flickering candlelight while cities burned above. They speak of generals who lied to their soldiers, priests who bartered with killers, and scientists whose ambitions pushed beyond morality into nightmare. These are not the stories carved into monuments or repeated in classrooms. They are the forbidden accounts, the blacked-out paragraphs of history that, when pieced together, reveal a world far darker than the official record admits. Each revelation feels like the flicker of a projector in an abandoned war room. Grainy images of men in uniforms, briefcases sliding across tables, and documents stamped with names of the dead. The corridors of power echo with these secrets, waiting for those willing to listen. Tonight, we unseal 4 files once thought destroyed. We trace them from Warsaw's ruins to Vatican chambers, from Alpine mines to Gestapo vaults. The shadows are long, the silence heavy. What remains is not myth, it is history that was never meant to surface. Chapter 1. The Warsaw Shadow Conspiracy Files. In the heart of Poland, 1944, the city of Warsaw burned under German artillery fire, while Soviet divisions halted on the opposite bank of the Vistula River. Official history describes it as a tragic delay, a failure of coordination. But in the hidden corners of Soviet and German archives, declassified fragments suggest something far more sinister. A file marked Directive Vistula and sealed with NKVD insignia hints at a calculated pause. According to the document dated August 7, 1944, Stalin's intelligence chiefs ordered the First Belarusian Front to suspend their advance, despite standing within artillery range of the collapsing German defenses. Why? The answer lies in covert communications, exchange between Soviet handlers and surviving remnants of the German Abwehr. Polish resistance fighters of the Armia Krajowa had expected Soviet aid. They rose in defiance on August 1st, determined to liberate their city before the Red Army arrived. Yet, as the streets filled with barricades and home-built weapons, the NKVD encrypted transmissions, intercepted later by MI6, revealed deliberate instructions to wait. The Soviets knew the Germans would crush the uprising brutally, and in allowing it, Stalin would ensure that no independent Polish authority could challenge Moscow's post-war dominance. For 2 months, Warsaw was left to bleed while across the river. Soviet tanks idled under strict orders not to intervene. Declassified communications reference midnight exchanges in abandoned railway depots. A document labeled File D77 to Black Eagle describes transfers of captured Polish couriers, codebooks, and dismantled Enigma parts between German officers and Soviet intermediaries. At first glance, it reads like a fantasy of collaboration, yet corroborating details emerge from British intelligence files preserved in Hanslope Park. One report, initialed by Brigadier Colin Gubbins of the Special Operations Executive, confirms movement of sealed crates across no man's land, bearing insignia of both Reichsadler and Soviet Star. These were not accidents of war, they were transactions. The brutality of the Warsaw Uprising remains one of the most harrowing civilian catastrophes of the Second World War. Over 200,000 Poles were slaughtered, women and children executed in the streets, buildings reduced to rubble under the systematic destruction of SS units commanded by Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski. Yet the question that lingers in these files is not only why Germany acted with such fury, but why Moscow chose to remain silent witnesses. A Soviet field report, recovered from archives in Smolensk and dated September 12th, states bluntly, "The liquidation of bourgeois nationalist elements has proceeded without Red Army expenditure." For the Kremlin, every Polish death removed a potential rival to communist authority. Churchill's cabinet received word of these developments through coded MI6 intercepts. A memorandum now released under the British National Archives, catalogue number FO3713942-8, includes the chilling sentence, "Prime Minister advised of Soviet deliberate inaction. Recommended silence on grounds of future alliance necessity." This was the logic of great powers, to sacrifice an entire nation's capital for the sake of diplomatic balance and post-war influence. In official post-war rhetoric, the uprising was framed as a heroic tragedy. In these hidden files, it becomes an engineered extermination of political opposition. The files also reference a mysterious figure known only as Handler Vistula, believed to be a Soviet liaison who arranged prisoner swaps with German Abwehr units retreating westward. Testimonies from captured German officers at Nuremberg trial footnotes, omitted from public transcripts but stored in annexes, mention the handover of resistance leaders under cover of night. These men were not executed immediately, but transported eastward, vanishing into NKVD prisons. Their names disappear from German execution records, yet resurface faintly in Soviet Gulag manifests. Imagine the scene described in File D77-1, a derelict railway yard, silent under curfew, the air heavy with smoke from distant fires. A convoy of trucks arrives under blackout conditions. Soldiers unload wooden crates stamped with Reich markings, sliding them across the cracked platform. Opposite them, Soviet officers stand in silence, exchanging brief nods. Documents are signed, but no words recorded. Within the crates, not only code machines, but also dossiers, lists of resistance operatives, radio frequencies, safe house addresses. The very infrastructure of Poland's underground movement betrayed through collusion. Once transferred, the Germans resume their campaign of annihilation, while the Soviets wait patiently, their objective achieved without firing a single shot. For decades, survivors of the uprising told stories of Soviet betrayal, but their claims were dismissed as bitterness. Only with the slow trickle of declassification after the Cold War did fragments align. Polish historians working in the early 1990s uncovered copies of Soviet orders preserved by defectors. The most damning line from an NKVD directive, dated August 9th, "Do not cross Vistula. Allow Germans to eradicate insurgent force. Future control requires no competition." With those sentences, history bends into darkness. By mid-September, the Soviets finally advanced, but only when Warsaw was reduced to ash and its defenders annihilated. Their arrival was not salvation but occupation. Red banners replaced swastikas, and NKVD prisons filled with the few surviving Polish officers who had escaped German firing squads. The uprising had been extinguished, not by German firepower alone, but by Soviet calculation. And what of the British and Americans? The files hint at complicity by omission. American supply drops requested by the Poles were delayed, restricted, or sabotaged by Soviet refusal to grant air corridor rights. Churchill pressed Roosevelt to challenge Stalin, but Washington remained silent, bound by the necessity of maintaining alliance against Japan and the remaining German divisions. The silence was deafening, and for Warsaw, deadly. The Warsaw Shadow Conspiracy remains one of the most unsettling revelations of World War II. It strips away the myths of heroic delay and reveals instead a chilling chess game where civilians were pawns, sacrificed by both sides. The Germans sought annihilation, the Soviets sought political monopoly, and the Allies sought silence. Every archive fragment, every coded intercept, every smuggled page reinforces the same brutal truth. Warsaw was left to die, not because it could not be saved, but because its survival did not serve the interests of the great powers. Even now, questions remain. How deep did the collusion between NKVD and Abwehr truly run? Were these exchanges tactical necessities? Or were they deliberate partnerships designed to manage the battlefield for post-war advantage? The surviving documents are incomplete, burned at the edges, missing entire pages. What they reveal is only a shadow, a glimpse of a darker reality. And in those shadows, Warsaw remains not just a symbol of resistance, but of betrayal on a global scale. The file is closed with the stamp, classified, do not release. Yet here, in fragments, its voice breaks the silence. Chapter 2, Operation Iron Wolf Suppression Dossier. In the labyrinth of Gestapo archives seized at the end of the war, there exists a collection of charred, half-destroyed documents bearing the classification, File number 17K. Each page is stamped with the black insignia of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence arm of the SS. Among the fragments lies reference to a covert counterintelligence program executed in the Baltic territories during 1943. Its codename, Unternehmen Eisenwolf, or Operation Iron Wolf. Officially, It was described as an effort to identify and eliminate double agents embedded within the German war machine, traitors feeding Moscow with troop movements and supply routes. Yet the fragments that survived incineration tell a far more insidious story. They reveal a campaign not only of purges, but of deception engineered on a scale previously unseen, where truth itself became a weapon deployed against enemies and allies alike. The documents open in June 1943 in occupied Lithuania. The Wehrmacht's Eastern Front was collapsing under the pressure of Soviet offensives. Within Army Group North, paranoia grew that local collaborators were leaking vital information to Moscow. The SD was tasked with rooting out the leaks. What began as routine surveillance quickly evolved into a systematic operation designed not simply to capture double agents, but to turn them into instruments of misinformation. The SS discovered that a captured partisan, if broken and controlled, could be repurposed as a channel for carefully planted disinformation. To mask the manipulation, entire staged operations were crafted. Reports detail Einsatzgruppe detachments conducting massacres, then deliberately planting forged partisan insignia on the bodies, allowing rumors to spread of Soviet atrocities against civilians. Each scene was meticulously choreographed to erode local trust in the Red Army's underground networks. A surviving memorandum, preserved only because it was intercepted by a retreating courier near Kaunas, bears the signature of SS Brigade Führer Walter Schellenberg, the head of foreign intelligence. The memo, dated July 11, 1943, commands, all activities of Operation Eisenwolf are to be erased from the official war diary. Any mention outside designated channels will be treated as treason punishable by summary execution. His orders extended to the destruction of correspondence, the silencing of witnesses, and the creation of shadow files kept only in Berlin. Yet the courier bag intercepted by Soviet patrols preserved fragments that escaped the flames. These fragments, decades later, found their way into British custody at Hanslope Park, where they remained hidden until the late 1970s. The testimonies of those who survived imprisonment under Operation Iron Wolf illuminate its darker dimensions. Prisoners of the 9th Fort near Kaunas described being subjected not merely to torture, but to psychological experiments. Some were forced to transmit radio messages to Moscow, dictated word for word by their SS handlers, while others were allowed to escape with false documents, carrying misinformation designed to mislead Soviet command about troop concentrations. One testimony, preserved in Polish underground records, recounts a prisoner forced to attend the aftermath of a staged massacre. They dressed the dead in Red Army uniforms. They smeared their faces with soot. They left leaflets calling for uprising. And then they let me go, knowing I would tell what I saw. The result was predictable: confusion, mistrust, and a collapse of coordination among partisan cells already stretched to breaking. What makes the Iron Wolf dossier most chilling is its foreshadowing of tactics, later employed during the early Cold War. The concept of the manufactured traitor, the engineered narrative, and the false flag massacre would resurface in Soviet counterinsurgency operations across Eastern Europe during the 1950s. Researchers examining KGB training manuals note striking similarities to the methods described in Gestapo fragments, suggesting a grim continuity that the techniques pioneered by SS officers in Lithuania were studied, adapted, and repurposed by their supposed enemies after the Reich collapsed. The destruction of evidence was nearly absolute. An order from Himmler himself, dated December 1943 and signed with his distinctive green pencil, demanded that all traces of Iron Wolf are to be liquidated with utmost urgency. Many documents were incinerated in field furnaces, yet the courier bag, recovered in the confusion of retreat, contained ledger entries, execution lists, and coded transmissions. One transmission, sent from Kaunas to Berlin in October 1943, references the success of a staged partisan raid. Eisenwolf procedure effective. Enemy command diverted artillery to non-existent sector. Casualties among collaborators acceptable. These words expose not only the cynicism of the operation, but its efficiency. Through manipulation, the SS redirected Soviet strikes, conserving their own dwindling resources while sowing terror among the population. British files show that knowledge of Iron Wolf reached London during the war, though little was done with it. A Special Operations Executive Report from 1944, catalogued under SOE Est Oriental, mentions reports of orchestrated massacres designed to appear Soviet in origin. The language is clinical, detached, and without follow-up. For the British, embroiled in their own deceptions like Operation Fortitude, such reports were unsurprising. What mattered was not the morality, but the strategic outcome. Thus the fragments were collected, filed, and forgotten, until their rediscovery decades later forced a re-evaluation of how far the SS was willing to weaponize perception itself. Consider the visual detail described in survivor accounts. A Lithuanian farmer recalled stumbling upon a barn where civilians had been executed. Each corpse bore armbands painted hastily with hammer and sickle insignia. Soviet propaganda leaflets littered the ground, yet the ink was fresh, the paper a quality unavailable to genuine partisan presses. The deception was crude yet effective in an environment already poisoned by fear and rumor. Villagers believed the Soviets had turned against their own supporters, driving a wedge between resistance groups and the populations they relied upon. In one village, near WWII, trust collapsed so completely that civilians refused to feed partisans hiding in the forests, dooming dozens to starvation. The psychological toll of Iron Wolf was profound. It blurred lines between enemy and ally, between truth and fabrication. Resistance fighters no longer knew whether their comrades were genuine or puppets. Soviet intelligence officers began executing suspected double agents in growing numbers, sometimes killing loyal operatives whose only crime was survival under German captivity. The result was a collapse of cohesion that served German interests far more effectively than brute force ever could. By war's end, Lithuanian resistance was fragmented, demoralized, and easily suppressed when the Red Army swept in during 1944. And yet, like many operations designed in darkness, Iron Wolf did not vanish with the fall of Berlin. Its tactics lingered in memory, whispered among survivors, studied quietly by intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. For the West, it served as a reminder of the dangers of perception warfare. For the Soviets, it became a blueprint for their own campaigns of misinformation. In both cases, the truth remained locked away, classified, denied. Only in scattered testimonies and half-burned pages does the reality of Iron Wolf survive. A campaign where corpses were staged like actors, where words were more deadly than bullets, and where betrayal was not discovered but manufactured. The file closes with silence, stamped once again with the order, Vernichtung, destroy immediately. Yet fragments endure, whispering of a theatre of shadows that history was never meant to see. Chapter 3. The Black Mercury Project Records. In the fading months of 1945, as Germany collapsed and Allied armies converged from east and west, a hidden layer of the Reich's military research was quietly dispersed into the mountains of Bavaria. The official record describes the hunt for V2 scientists and engineers, Werner von Braun and his Peenemünde team, who were captured and transferred under Operation Paperclip. Yet buried within a cache of OSS reports, catalogued under Archive 642C, lies reference to another project, one shrouded in greater secrecy, codenamed Project Schwarzes Quecksilber, the Black Mercury Project. Unlike the V2 program, which had already devastated London, this project never entered the official histories. It was concealed in abandoned mines, its fragments scattered across burned ledgers and missing transport manifests. Its aim, to develop a propulsion system based not on liquid oxygen and ethanol, but on volatile mercury isotopes, unstable, dangerous, and potentially capable of sustaining flight far beyond the reach of conventional rockets. The records begin with a chilling report from an OSS field team that entered Obersalzberg in May 1945. Beneath the Alpine slopes, they discovered an abandoned shaft sealed with explosive charges. Inside, charred fragments of technical drawings described HGX, a compound believed to be enriched mercury derived from industrial shipments routed through occupied Czechoslovakia. One fragment reads, HGX provides combustion of duration threefold standard LOX. Potential application, intercontinental delivery system. If authentic, these notes suggested the Reich was experimenting with a propulsion fuel powerful enough to reach not merely London or Moscow, but perhaps even the eastern seaboard of the United States. The implications were so severe that the documents were immediately stamped, restricted, national security interest, and transferred to Washington. Never acknowledged publicly, the Black Mercury files reference engineers of the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Ordnance Office, working under Dr. Wilhelm Ohnesorger, a figure often dismissed as a bureaucrat. Yet Ohnesorger's background was steeped in radiophysics and experimental fuels. Surviving interrogation notes suggest he oversaw teams in remote Bavarian installations, directing experiments in sealed chambers where mercury compounds were heated under immense pressure. Survivors interviewed after the war recalled a smell of scorched metal and a haze of toxic vapor that lingered in the tunnels. Several prisoners forced to work on the project died not from beatings or malnutrition, but from mercury poisoning. Their skin darkened, their hair falling in clumps, their minds slipping into madness. These deaths were not recorded in official Reich labor logs, but smuggled testimonies align with the descriptions of black mercury experiments. The most disturbing element lies in the transportation records. In February 1945, with the Reich collapsing, a series of sealed steel containers were loaded onto U-boats departing from Kiel. The manifest listed them simply as HG, cargo. OSS analysts later speculated these were shipments of HGX compound intended for relocation to sympathetic regimes abroad. South America, particularly Argentina, emerges repeatedly in decrypted Abwehr communications. MI6 decrypts held at Bletchley Park reference Wotan transfer via Atlantic Channel, Kite G secure. The fate of these containers remains unknown. None were found among the wrecks of sunken U-boats catalogued by Allied navies. They vanished into the ocean or arrived at destinations still concealed in archives resistant to disclosure. Soviet intelligence, the GRU, also uncovered fragments of the project. A Soviet report dated October 1945, preserved in Moscow's Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, describes captured German scientists en route to Moscow who failed to arrive. Their transport was ambushed somewhere in the American zone of occupation. The Soviets accused US authorities of deliberately seizing the men, a claim denied in public, but echoed quietly in the corridors of the OSS. These disappearances suggest a shadow conflict over the spoils of Nazi science, one in which black mercury was considered too valuable to share. Unlike the V2 program, which could be paraded as a technological triumph, the toxic legacy of mercury-based fuels was too dangerous, too unstable, and perhaps too closely tied to weapons of mass destruction to acknowledge. The scientific plausibility of mercury isotopes as fuel has long been debated. Post-war physicists dismissed the concept as impractical, citing the instability of mercury vapor under combustion. Yet the records in Archive 642C insist on documented test firings. One note, dated March 1945, describes a static vertical ignition lasting 182 seconds, producing thrust exceeding V2 by 60%. No surviving hardware has been found to verify these claims, but the language of the documents mirrors that of technical engineers, not propagandists. For the men of the OSS who catalogued the files, the question was not whether the tests occurred, but how close the Reich had come to operational deployment, and what happened to the missing materials. Eyewitness descriptions from American soldiers who entered the mines paint a haunting picture. One recalled descending into shafts lined with metallic residue, walls slick with a shimmering substance that glowed faintly in torchlight. Another described rows of sealed cylinders, each marked with the double lightning bolt insignia of the SS and stamped with chemical hazard symbols. The air was suffocating, and protective masks were issued before the tunnels were cleared. Most of the cylinders were destroyed on-site under Allied orders, detonated to prevent contamination. Yet several disappeared before demolition, removed by unknown parties, perhaps spirited into secret research programs that would later form the foundation of Cold War aerospace projects. Historians have since speculated whether black mercury was connected to the unexplained propulsion. Experiments rumored in South America during the late 1940s. Argentine naval reports describe sightings of luminous objects moving at impossible speeds, dismissed officially as hysteria, but whispered about in intelligence circles. If the U-boat shipments arrived safely, they may have seeded laboratories far from Europe, continuing research in secrecy. No definitive proof has surfaced, yet the echoes of black mercury linger in these accounts like shadows that refuse to fade. The moral dimension of the project is equally grim. Prisoner laborers recalled being forced to handle liquid mercury with bare hands, their skin blistering and lungs burning from fumes. A Polish survivor later testified, "They told us we were working on a weapon to save Germany. We could not breathe, we could not stand. Those who collapsed were dragged away and never returned." Such testimonies were excluded from the Nuremberg trials, as Allied prosecutors focused on crimes more easily proven. The victims of Black Mercury vanished into silence, their suffering erased by the larger geopolitical prize, technological dominance in the emerging Cold War. The record closes with a stark contradiction. Official US Air Force histories make no mention of Mercury-based propulsion, yet a memorandum from General Hoyt Vandenberg to President Truman, dated December 1946, references the necessity of absolute secrecy regarding HGX-derived technologies. Public acknowledgement inadvisable. Why would such a statement exist if the project were a fiction? The answer remains locked in classified vaults, but the surviving documents suggest that Black Mercury was not merely an experiment, but a threshold, one too dangerous to cross openly, yet too valuable to discard. As with the other hidden files of the war, Black Mercury reveals a truth darker than any battlefield victory. It suggests that the real struggle in 1945 was not only against Nazi Germany, but over who would inherit its forbidden science. The race for missiles, for rockets, for the skies themselves, did not begin in the celebrated laboratories of Huntsville or Baikonur. It began in a poisoned mine beneath the Bavarian Alps, where engineers of a dying Reich gambled on Mercury, and where their secrets slipped silently into the Cold War's deepest shadows. The file ends not with a conclusion, but with an absence. Missing containers, missing scientists, missing records. A silence that stretches from the ruins of Bavaria to the archives of Washington and Moscow, reminding us that history's most dangerous weapons are often the ones we are told never existed. Chapter 4. The Vatican's Midnight Treaty Files. In the war-torn landscape of 1943 Italy, while Allied armies pushed northward through Sicily and German divisions tightened their grip on Rome, another negotiation was unfolding behind the walls of the Vatican. It was a negotiation cloaked in secrecy, carried out in candlelit chambers under frescoed ceilings, far removed from the sound of bombs. Fragments of intelligence files, drawn from OSS intercepts labeled Rome Station, 1943, and long suppressed by Vatican archivists, reveal references to what became known among Allied codebreakers as the Midnight Treaty. These papers suggest that emissaries of the Reich Foreign Ministry, senior clerics from the Vatican Secretariat of State, and intermediaries tied to Italian partisan networks met in the small hours of the night to draft agreements never acknowledged in official records. Their aim was stark: to facilitate the safe withdrawal of select German divisions from central Italy in exchange for Vatican protection of cultural treasures and confiscated assets hidden inside monastic vaults. The first evidence of such dealings emerged from a decrypted OSS cable dated November 2, 1943. It reported that truck convoys bearing Wehrmacht insignia entered Vatican jurisdiction under cover of curfew, cargo believed to be gold and artworks removed from Jewish families. The cable, filed under Rome Station File 112A, also noted that Vatican guards were observed at the gates during these transfers, turning away curious onlookers. Though the Vatican has consistently denied any direct collaboration, the consistency of multiple intercepts raises troubling questions. Allied operatives described German officers entering the Apostolic Palace through side entrances after midnight, escorted not by soldiers but by priests. Meetings lasted hours. When the officers departed, their convoys were lighter, their routes unmolested. The Midnight Treaty files also reference the presence of Cardinal Luigi Malleone, the Vatican Secretary of State, though his personal involvement remains contested. His diary entries from the period are missing, torn from bound volumes preserved in the Vatican secret archives. What survives is the testimony of OSS officer Vincent Scamperino, who wrote in a 1944 field report, "High-level mediation between Reich representatives and the Holy See has been confirmed by 3 independent informants. Objective appears to secure safe corridor for retreat while preserving Vatican interests." These words, buried in Washington for decades, suggest not accidental contact but structured negotiation. The German objective was clear. With Allied advances threatening their positions in southern Italy, retreat northward required protected passage. The Vatican's objective was more ambiguous. The files indicate concern over the preservation of sacred relics, archives, and assets confiscated by the Reich. Crates marked with papal seals were observed on Wehrmacht trucks in December 1943, according to a report catalogued as OSS Intercept, Rome, 423 tanks. The report speculates these crates contained manuscripts, chalices, and possibly even Jewish artifacts seized during Nazi raids on Roman synagogues. Where these shipments ultimately went remains unknown. None were recovered after the liberation of Rome in June 1944. Their trail vanishes into the Alps or across the Adriatic into hidden caches never catalogued. Partisans who operated in Rome during this period remembered German convoys moving at night, escorted not by Waffen-SS but by Italian clergy. One partisan, captured later and interrogated by Soviet forces, claimed to have seen priests blessing departing trucks at the edge of the city. Though such testimonies can be dismissed as rumor, they align disturbingly with multiple intelligence fragments. In one Gestapo dispatch intercepted near Florence, German officers expressed gratitude for ecclesiastical mediation that allowed redeployment without partisan interference. This phrase, coded and vague, nevertheless appears repeatedly in correspondence, suggesting an arrangement formal enough to be acknowledged within Reich channels. When Rome fell to Allied forces in June 1944, investigators scoured Vatican relations for evidence of collaboration. They found little beyond whispers and inconsistencies. The official Allied communique stated that the Vatican had maintained neutrality throughout the conflict. Yet in Soviet archives, denunciations tell a different story. GRU reports accused the Vatican of acting as intermediary, not only for asset transfers, but for facilitating the so-called rat line, escape routes that allowed Nazi officers to flee to South America after the war. While the Midnight Treaty predates these networks, it appears to have laid the groundwork for clandestine cooperation between clerical institutions and fleeing Reich personnel. The continuity is striking. Convoys moving at night, protection under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, assets concealed within church properties. The ethical implications are profound. If the Vatican entered into midnight agreements, it did so while Jews were being deported from Rome under German supervision. Thousands were seized in October 1943 and sent to Auschwitz, most never to return. Yet during these same months, Vatican channels may have been negotiating over art, gold, and the safe passage of German units. To the Allies, silence was convenient. The stability of post-war Italy depended on maintaining the Church's influence. To the Soviets, however, the story was ammunition, a weapon used to paint the Vatican as complicit in fascist crimes. Each side manipulated fragments of truth, while the actual documents remained sealed in guarded archives. The Midnight Treaty has never been acknowledged by the Holy See. Vatican officials deny any record of such meetings. Yet the missing diary pages, the sealed crates, the intercepted OSS cables, and the corroborating Gestapo phrases form a mosaic too precise to dismiss. Even within Allied intelligence, doubts persisted. A British report dated July 1944 concluded, "Plausibility of ecclesiastical mediation remains high. Political consequences of disclosure unacceptable." The final line, underlined twice, read, "This matter is closed." Visualize the setting described in the fragments. Candlelit chambers within the Apostolic Palace, blackout curtains drawn against the city's curfew, the sound of distant artillery faint beyond the walls. German officers in field grey uniforms sit across from clerics in scarlet robes, the table between them cluttered with maps and manifests. Documents are signed in silence, stamped with Reich insignia on one side and Vatican seals on the other. Outside, Roman families huddle in cellars, unaware that decisions taken at this table will determine which German units escape northward unchallenged, and which treasures vanish into history's shadows. The air is heavy with incense and cigarette smoke. The clocks strike midnight, and another treaty is born, not carved into marble, but hidden in ink and secrecy. The disappearance of the treaty papers after the war is itself telling. OSS cables referencing the meetings were reclassified in 1947, transferred to deep storage under the designation Cultural Property Protection. The files resurfaced briefly during the 1970s when a Senate subcommittee on war loot requested access, only to be denied. To this day, only fragments remain available to scholars, and Vatican archives remain closed on all materials post-dating 1939. The silence is as deliberate as the midnight meetings themselves. The Midnight Treaty remains one of the most forbidden files of the war. It suggests not merely collaboration, but a collision of faith, survival, and politics at the heart of Europe's darkest hour. In the shadows of Rome, while civilians starved and resistance fighters died, deals were struck that shaped the escape of German divisions and the disappearance of looted heritage. These were choices never meant to reach daylight, sealed in vaults both temporal and eternal. And as with all the hidden files of World War II, their absence from the official record is itself an answer, an indictment, and a reminder. History is not only what we are told, but what we are not allowed to know. In the dim light of forgotten archives, the echoes of war never truly fade. The files we have unearthed, Warsaw's conspiracy, the shadow play of Iron Wolf, the toxic promise of Black Mercury, and the Vatican's midnight dealings, are not the polished accounts of textbooks or the carefully curated narratives of memorials. They are fragments, scorched at the edges, their pages stamped with secrecy and silence. Together, they reveal a disturbing pattern, that the Second World War was not only fought with tanks and bombers, but with betrayals in backrooms, with hidden treaties signed under candlelight, with science too dangerous to acknowledge, and with the deliberate sacrifice of entire populations for the ambitions of the few. The official record insists on clear lines, allies and Axis, victims and perpetrators. But these forbidden files blur those lines until loyalty, morality, and truth dissolve into a fog of expedience. What remains are unanswered questions. How many more agreements were struck and erased? How many technologies were buried in the name of security? How many lives were traded away in silence? Each file closed with the mark "classified" is a reminder that history is not complete but curated. The corridors of power, from Moscow to Washington, from Berlin to Rome, kept their secrets because those secrets secured futures built on silence. As the doors of the archive close once more, we are left with a haunting certainty. The past we know is only the surface, and beneath it, in the locked cabinets and burned ledgers, lies a darker truth that was never meant to be told.